Anglian branch, and welcome to another one of our branch events. This time we're bringing you a session on accidents and near-miss reporting. Welcome especially to any new members or to anybody who hasn't joined us before, and those from other branches or further afield. It's really good to have you with us. Spring was here last week. We've gone a bit chilly again, unfortunately, and although we shouldn't be complacent, we've got some nice lighter evenings now. COVID numbers are decreasing and vaccinations are well underway, so the future is hopefully looking a bit brighter for us all now. So before I hand you on to my Vice Chair, Rachel, who's organised today, there's just a bit of housekeeping as usual. Can you please all make sure your microphones are on mute? It does help with our sound quality and it makes us able to hear our speakers properly without any background noise or people popping in with coffee and that sort of thing. We're recording this session so that we can upload the events to our various platforms and the branch website in case everybody misses today or hasn't had the opportunity to join us. We will be taking questions at the end of the session, and one of our committee, Kane, I think, will be monitoring them and putting them to the speaker for you at the end. If you can just pop a big Q, capital Q, in the chat box, followed by your question or comment, that would be really useful. The other thing is, I think Ian, our speaker today, is going to ask questions along the line, and he may be just asking for a few comments. So if you can do that, that's lovely. But if you want to put a question for the end, that big Q at the front really helps us. I need to just mention our upcoming AGM. It's that time of year again. We're all up for re-election, all of the committee. So you never know, this might be the last time that I welcome you from the chair, although I hope that's not the case. Our AGM is planned for April, and East Anglian members will get a reminder via email and a committee mailer closer to the time, so watch out for that. Historically, we used to do the AGM face-to-face, and those who attended the AGM were the ones that were able to vote on the day. Last year it was a bit different as lockdown was very fresh in April, which is why I for one was co-opted. But this year COVID has kind of given us an opportunity to do this in a more wider sense. And voting is going to be controlled by IOSH centrally and is going to be done online involving all members. The nominations for committee closed on the 1st of March, and our committee members who wish to serve again, which is most of us, and hopefully some potential new members who put themselves forward as volunteers for the committee have now submitted their forms and a little bit about themselves, a bit of a bio. So you'll soon be receiving formal notification from IOSH as to who these candidates are. Quite exciting actually, as we don't know ourselves yet either, and I look forward to seeing who stepped forward. So please look out for this, read the bios and cast your vote for who you'd like to see serving you on next year's committee. It's important to us all to have your support, so thank you in advance for that. So now I'm going to hand over to Rachel Marriott. She's my vice chair and she'll tell you more about our speaker today and today's events. Thank you, and I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Angela. Hi, everybody. It's great for you to join us today. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Ian Pemberton to the group today. He's the Managing Director of Human Focus, has been for 29 years, which is a pretty good record in itself. Human Focus are a global leader in behavioural change management in the workplace. So lots of hints and tips, hopefully, from Ian today. He's also a chartered ergonomist and has got a past career with the Department of Work and Pensions and the Health and Safety Executive, and is also an esteemed author. So you can perhaps check out his additional work after the event. So in terms of today's presentation on accident, incident and near-miss reporting and investigation, it's obviously a fundamental element of good health and safety management and something that IOSH professionals are actively involved in, probably on a daily basis to some extent. So Ian is going to share with us some hints and tips and case studies looking at competency levels and how that can support us, and also how we can get employees to actually report incidents and accidents, which we often struggle with as professionals. So Ian, delighted to introduce you, and over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I will just kick off by sharing my screen. Can you see my screen now? Excellent. So fabulous to be with you this morning at this East Anglia branch meeting of IOSH. Let me just kick off my slideshow. There's the title, How Accidents and Near-Miss Reporting Can Transform Your Safety Culture. Just very briefly, just to extend, thank you for that introduction, Rachel. I am a chartered ergonomist. I've been working in this space of health safety in the workplace with a particular focus on skilled behaviour and how we can help our colleagues to perform more effectively in their workplace. I just wanted to briefly mention that I have worked in partnership with AIG since 2007. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because this has taken me on a global journey. I've really worked around the world with AIG and gone into workplaces around the globe. And so one of the things I'm hoping to bring to you today is some of the insights I've gained from working with clients literally around the world. So it's across global boundaries, different cultures, but there are many common themes when it comes to this thing called accident incident reporting. I have started working more recently with Zurich in a similar kind of way. So I have a fairly broad experience in terms of the types of workplaces that I've gone into. So this presentation this morning, there's three sections. The problem, then I want to go into a framework for success, and then, as Rachel has indicated, trying to give you some tips and pointers as to how you maybe start to put some of this information into practice. I am an avid reader of the science. I spend a significant part of my daily week reading the latest science and science books. So I'm going to point you to the science. This is trying to adopt an evidence-based approach this morning. First thing is, the title is How Accident and Near-Miss Reporting Can Transform Your Safety Culture. So the first question with you is, what is your accident incident reporting system for? Why have you got it? What is it you are trying to achieve with this thing? Sounds like an obvious question, doesn't it? So, by all means, type that in there if you want to. But a lot of the time when I go into client sites, it's often a basic compliance-led thing where we've got to report incidents, accidents, we've got to show we're doing it. But if you look at world-class organizations, those that are really achieving high levels of performance in this area, what you see is they're actually utilizing this system to actually transform the way their organization works. They're using it as a key tool to transform their safety culture. So that one of the really positive messages today is this is a massive opportunity for you, and often, unfortunately, a massive missed opportunity, because as Rachel has indicated there, a lot of the time, a lot of organizations struggle with this stuff. They struggle to make it effective and really embed it into their organization. So let's kick off then, and let's go into the first section briefly. First thing to say is this session is ostensibly about failure. If you think about it, it's about getting our colleagues to come to us with, reporting when things have gone wrong, whether there's an accident, incident, near miss, or whatever. But actually, paradoxically, it's about how we can turn that understanding of failure and turn it into then lessons that we can affect successful performance or implement successful performance. So this today is all about how you can improve successful performance in your organization. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is some of the underlying processes of how, as humans, we learn and how we develop our understanding, because this is a key part of making these type of systems work in practice. Now, if you go to the aviation sector as one example, this is a sector that takes failure very, very seriously and have developed really excellent systems of reporting and learning from failure. And it is one of the reasons why this sector, in my opinion, is preeminent in its safety performance. They are brilliant at learning from failed performance, increasingly as well from successful performance. but they have in place ways of getting this information in, learning the lessons and getting it out again. And we're going to look briefly at some of the techniques that they use to do that. So we can learn from world leaders, and that's what we are going to try and do. So it's all about having the right systems, but ultimately the right culture, because if you haven't got a learning culture in place, you're not going to be getting the information you need. You're not going to be getting the right effects or outputs from your incident reporting. So I just want to kick off by telling you a little story. This chap here is one of my heroes. You may have heard of him. It's Paul O'Neill. He was the managing director of the global manufacturer Alcoa. They're a manufacturer of aluminium. They've been manufacturing aluminium for over 100 years. And when he took over in 1987, he was the CEO for 13 years. This organization was failing and failing badly in terms of commercial performance. And on his first day, he had to go to a Wall Street investors meeting, and he walked into a top-end Manhattan hotel, and he stood up in front of all of these investors, and he said, "I want to talk to you today about worker safety. Because what you need to know is that within Alcoa, too many employees every year are so badly injured that they have to take a very significant period of time off work. And I want my legacy in this organization to be that when I leave, that Alcoa should become one of the safest employers' workplaces in the world. And if we cannot do that, if we cannot get safety right, you should be damn skeptical about anything else that this management team is able to do." Now, the audience sat there in stunned silence. They started looking around at each other thinking, what is this guy talking about? This is an investors meeting. This is a Wall Street investors meeting. Why is he talking to us about safety? And so one of these Wall Street investors put their hand up, trying to get the meeting back on track. He asked a question about stock control at one of their aviation subsidiaries, but Paul O'Neill was not having none of it. He said, "I don't think you understood me when I said the first thing there. Safety is the preeminent thing that we need to focus on if we are going to be successful. If we can get that right, everything else will follow from it." At which point, literally, over half of the room stood up and walked out. They ran to get their phones out and to make phone calls. And one of them actually reported saying, "Sell, sell, sell. They put a loony in charge of this company. He's going to crash and burn." And 13 years later, Paul O'Neill, reflecting on that landmark meeting, said, "They literally thought I was mad." But the reality was that piece of advice that particular stockbroker gave was, in his own admission, the world's worst piece of financial advice. It's right up there with the guy who turned away those 4 Liverpudlians who came to them, with these soundtrack, and they were called the Beatles, and he turned them away. Or the publisher who looked at these stories of young wizards in this thing called Hogwarts and said, no, we're not going to publish that. It's right up there. Because the reality was, within 12 months, Alcoa's performance had already massively transformed. Their stock value went up by $27 billion. And over the course of the 13 years that Paul O'Neill was in charge of that company, it was utterly transformed. If you had $1 million invested on that day of that speech, you would have gotten another $1 million back in dividends, in dividends, let alone your share value. Massive success story. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because Paul O'Neill achieved this commercial success through accident and incident reporting. That's how he did it. So let's take a brief look at some of the things he actually said. The first thing is, Paul O'Neill was talking about habit, and he was talking about what he called a keystone habit. And if you want to learn more a little bit about this, this is an excellent book if you haven't already seen it, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And in that book, actually, Charles Duhigg actually recounts in more detail the whole story of Paul O'Neill and what he did at Alcoa. But what we mean by a keystone habit is a fundamental behavior that actually has undue influence on everything else that goes on around us. So an example, one keystone habit would be sleep. If you get good sleep, it affects every part of your life. You have better relationships, you're more alert, you're safer, and so on. And the reverse is true. So sleep is a keystone habit. And we know when it comes to organizations that there are performance excellence. When it comes to performance excellence, these are some of the keystone habits: quality, productivity, innovation, and yes, health and safety. So what Paul O'Neill knew was that if he could affect health and safety, all of these other things would follow on too. And I'm going to demonstrate how this works in practice. So this is what he actually said. I decided I was going to start by focusing on one thing, and I would start by disrupting the habits around safety. And that if I could do that, it would spread around the entire company. If we could bring injury rates down, it will be because individuals in this company have agreed to become part of something special. They've devoted themselves to creating a habit of excellence. Safety will be the indicator that we're making progress in changing these habits across our entire institution. And that's how we're going to be judged. And this is how he did it. He said, I said we have to have a system that is worldwide, that we learn from every day with the expectation that it will be posted in 24 hours, and that every single one of our locations, there was 350 of these around the world, will act on that information if it is pertinent to their circumstances the next day. Bear that one in mind as we go forwards. So we speed up and we make every element of our individual company part of the notion of continuous learning, continuous improvement. And it was all involved around health and safety. So one example, a little story he tells. To kick this off, he went around every single one of these sites and he met with all the workforce at each site, and he had workers on one side, management on the other. And what he said to them was this. He said to the workers, your job is to identify problems. And when you identify them and report them, we're going to fix them. There's going to be no delay. And whatever it costs, we're going to fix it. Even if it's expensive, we're going to find a way to fund it and we're going to fix it. Your job is to tell us where the problems are, and then we're going to fix it. And then he turned to the management and said, your job is to work with your colleagues to fix it without any delay. And then he turned back to the frontline people and said, I'm telling you that if these guys and gals don't do it, here's my home phone number, give me a call. And what he said was, he was working hard to make it clear to everybody that it was real, that it was going to happen. He said, not many CEOs of global manufacturers give out their home phone numbers. And he said, again, a lot of people thought he was mad because he was going to get all these phone calls. In reality, he hardly got any, but he did get one about 3 weeks later from a frontline guy at one of their US plants. And this guy said, well, you said I should give you a call if things are not getting fixed. And I need to tell you that we got a production line down here and we're lifting these 50 kilo ingot aluminium, big blocks of aluminium from one line to another where there's usually a conveyor thing and it's broken, and we told them and it hasn't been fixed. And someone's going to drop one of these things and they're going to be maimed for life, and they're probably going to get a back injury during this process. Okay, leave it with me. He made the call, and of course it got fixed. And he said it was like the tom-tom drums. As soon as this went out, it was made clear that this is how we operate around here. So what I'm showing you here is to make this happen is a cultural thing. You need leadership from the top. But what language do senior management talk? Ultimately, we like to think it's, they're buying into safety. Maybe they are. And we often bang on about, safety is good business. Yes, Ian, I know that. I've been saying that for years. But think about this. and this is one thing that's, in my opinion, often misunderstood. It's not safety that pays the bills. It's safe production that pays the bills. The causal relationship actually is the other way around. Good safety comes from performance excellence in business, not the other way around. So we must be focused on helping our colleagues achieve performance excellence. And this is about learning and culture. And this is what Paul O'Neill knew. So yes, he's talking about safety, but ultimately what he was talking about is how can you do your job more efficiently, more effectively, in a safer way? And I'm facilitating that. And another key ingredient here, as we're going to see, is frontline involvement. Without the active participation of everybody out there, you're going to fail. And it's about giving them the competencies and skills to participate in this particular way. Final point in this section in terms of problems is though to say, unfortunately, the Alcoas of this world are very rare. And one of the reasons it's very rare is that failure is a threatening thing. You know, when things are going wrong, it's a threatening, and we have inbuilt biases as humans to want to cover that up, to not really want to go into that space. And what this ends up in many organizations is what are called closed loop systems. You have performance, but they're not getting proper feedback on that performance. And without that feedback loops, or lots of loops, they're not able to learn and they're not able to improve. And this is just fundamental to improving safety. It's fundamental to improving all other aspects of performance. There's a ton of science around this failure to learn, and it's just one example. You all know the Titanic, you've all seen the films, Leonardo, you know, and so on. You will know the story. It was traveling too fast in the middle of the night. It was supposedly an unsinkable ship. It hit an iceberg. 5 or more of the watertight compartments were breached. Too many, the water came over. As it was going down, it became apparent that there were not enough lifeboats, and so many people perished unnecessarily. Almost to the day, that was in January 1912, almost 100 years to the day, this happened. Costa Concordia, a ship, was traveling too fast to known hazards, and when it went down, there was a problem with the lifeboats because it went over. They couldn't disembark the lifeboat. Almost 100 years later. Now, I'm not denying that in the maritime section, generally speaking, there's been major advances in safety. Of course there have, but in this particular instance, in this particular shipping line, there was a failure to learn from lessons 100 years previously. So again, I don't have time today, but if you read the science, I mean, one area in particular has been very active in looking at the problem of learning from incident actions is actually the UK healthcare sector. There's been a lot of research reported there, and that's one place that you can go. But I'm sure it's probably not controversial to say that generally speaking out there, there's a big failure to learn from performance, particularly in a safety perspective. Let's move on then to look at a framework for success. Let me just take a gulp of water. This is a white paper from my own professional body. I'm a chartered ergonomist with the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, and I would highly recommend it to you. If you have not already seen this white paper, I will be sharing it. It's free. I will share a link to this document to you at the end of this presentation. In my opinion, this is a really excellent piece of work from a range of colleagues in my institute that put this together. And I really do think that it provides the gold standard now for how organizations should be thinking about how you learn from accidents and incidents. And what I want to do today is just briefly, and it is going to be brief, but I want to briefly take you through some of the headlines of this and give you some practical insights and experiences that I've come across in my travels. So in this white paper, when you get it, you'll see that there are 9 principles that they highlight are essential for an organization to learn from adverse events. I just love that title, you know, because the word learning is right up at the front. You know, think about, what is your accident incident reporting system for? What are you trying to achieve with it? And the clue is in the name that you give it right now. What do you call it? Accident incident investigation? Accident incident reporting? Maybe it would be better to get the word learning in there, because if that's what you want to do, that's what it should be called, surely. And this is part of the message here. You're going to have to go back out if that's not what you're doing at the moment and get that message over. This is about learning. This is about improving. It's not about finger pointing. And it's about helping everybody to get better at what we do. And that's why it's got that word learning up there. So anyway, here are the 9 principles. Here is a whirlwind tour of these 9 with some little anecdotes and stories to illustrate them. Principle number 1, you need to accept a broad range of evidence in your learning reviews. And I'm going to call them that rather than investigations. And in my experience, the vast majority of accident incidents, investigations that I see, they fail badly at this. They look at much too narrow a range of evidence. And in big part, that is due to a lack of competency in understanding the human factors of what's going on in that context. So here's a little story for you. This is Abraham Wold. Abraham Wold was a mathematician. He was a Jew. He was living in Vienna in the 1930s. And during the rise of Nazism, he saw that, you know, the writing was on the wall, and he was lucky enough to get out before the advent of the Second World War. He emigrated to America. It's a tragic story. He lost the vast majority of his family in the gas chambers of the concentration camps. And he dedicated his life to fighting extremism and Nazism in particular. And one project that he worked on was the American Air Force came to him during the Second World War, and they said, Abraham, we need to improve the armor on our heavy bombers going across Europe, because at the time, there was a 50% chance that these planes would not come back due to damage from anti-aircraft fire. And they said, look, Abraham, we've done this great analysis of these planes that are coming back, and these red dots indicate where all the bullet holes are. And what we're thinking about is putting armor in these red areas. What do you think? And so I'm going to ask you guys and gals out there, what do you think? Would you put the armor where those red dots are? Yes or no? Just type it in that. That's what the American Air Force, were going to be doing at that point. They were going to be putting the armor there. No. Excellent. Well done. So you wouldn't just look at the obvious. What Abraham Wold said to them was, look, you're only looking at a very small bit of the evidence here. The reality is you're only looking at the planes that are coming back. And what you should be looking at is the planes that are not coming back. And it's logical that the planes that are not coming back are the ones that will have bullet holes where you don't see them here, because these are the planes that are coming. You get the idea. And what he said was, don't put the armor here in the green space, put the armor here in the blue space, because that's where there's no bullet holes. It's counterintuitive, and it demonstrates that learning from failure is not obvious. It's not an easy thing to do. Here's a study by this Israeli psychologist. He looked into the performance of judges in Tel Aviv parole boards. So these were judges that were going through large numbers of cases and deciding whether they were going to give parole. And he was tracking their performance over many months to see how they actually got on. So there's a few of the stats. So they were doing between 14 and 35 cases a day, and they were very experienced judges, around 22 years on the bar. And this is what he found. In the morning, at 9 a.m., you had a 65% chance of parole, which dropped to near zero just before lunchtime. And then after lunch, you then had another 65% chance drop down. So that's really useful information if you ever find yourself in Israel, in prison, and you'd come up against a problem. Make sure you go either at 9 a.m. or 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. if you want a better chance of getting out. Now, when he showed these statistics to these judges, they were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe it. It was not apparent to them, this big change in performance. And as we're going to see, this is not unusual when we think about fatigue and how fatigue can affect people. So we're not talking about people like crashing cars or falling off the edge of things, but it does affect people in very subtle ways over the course of a day. The evidence is there, but it's often hidden, and you need to know what you're looking for. A couple of other examples, there's a lot of science around this, so if we just come back to reporting, you can start to analyze your reporting patterns. And we know that, for example, teams that go, there's no issue, no issue, no issue, no issue, no issue, no issue. That is very predictive of a team that is a higher risk in terms of accidents. These are the ones who probably are going to go on and have the incidents, as opposed to those who are actively reporting things. And I'll show you some more of the science of this later. The data's there, but it doesn't often get looked at because people don't have this understanding of what to look for, or indeed how to look for it. One of the messages I have for you today is you've got to get in a lot more data than just coming from incident reports from frontline. They are vital and they are the precursor, but there's a lot of other data out there that's relevant to your learning. Health and safety, finance, productivity, these all feed in. And you have to think about putting this into what is called data lakes, where you mix it all together and you can start to pull together this kind of correlations that are relevant to your analysis. And you can start to look at teams and locations, and you can start to draw analyses. And this is the so-called area of predictive safety, where you can actually start to move forwards in time based on these correlations that you're seeing. One of the issues is that you're going to be looking at large volumes of data potentially, and you're going to be looking at what's called fuzzy data that is not easy to analyze if you're just a lay person. But the good news is that there is the rise of the thing called artificial intelligence. This is an issue that's been highlighted in this month's magazine. There are issues with AI, but there are also massive potential opportunities, particularly in terms of organizational learning and accident and incident reporting. AI, it will be playing an increasing role, and you only have to look at how leading organizations are already using this technology and have been doing so for at least a decade. So it's not a new thing, it's been around for a long time. It's time now that the safety professional looked at this seriously as a tool. So moving on then, number 2. You need to learn beyond the actual loss event. I mean, apologies if I'm trying to tell what I assume everybody here today are experienced, highly trained health and safety professionals. But I'm sorry, but I go into almost routinely organizations, and when I look at their accident incident reports, there's always what happens. And then there's a section about root causes and corrective actions, but they vary. But the bottom line is that the analysis is almost all too often superficial and completely lacks an understanding of the contextual factors that were actually going on. It fails to get to the real systemic issues. And all too often the outcome is it's the operator, they need a bit of training. And one of the symptoms of this is when I speak to these highly experienced health and safety professionals, you can see and you can feel and you can hear the frustration in their voice. It's like, this was like, what were they doing? What were they thinking? It's like, it just seems inexplicable that they did this. It seems like stupid things. And then they don't say that, they don't put it in the report, but that is what they are thinking. And certainly they will talk to me privately and say that. And what that belies is a lack of understanding of again, the human factors. Nobody comes to work with the intention of having an accident. 100%, I guarantee you, practically, of your accidents, that person, what they were doing at that moment in time made complete sense to them. It's called, local rationality. For them, in that set of circumstances, what they were doing made complete sense. You need to understand the local context. And you also need to remember there's what's called a hindsight bias. We're all hardwired to look back at things and think, make armchair judgments and assessments as to what we would have done in that circumstances, but we were not there. We did not have the pressures and all the other things and the uncertainties that were going on at that moment in time. I guarantee if you get down and you dig, you will find these root causes, but you need the human factors knowledge within your investigation teams, and it's often lacking. So, again, I don't need to tell you, you've got to get to the root causes. 5 whys is one example of what you can do there, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. But there are many other techniques as well, particularly human factors-based techniques. Moving on then to number 3, avoid searching for blame. Unfortunately, blame is still the norm out there. I mean, the Costa Concordia, it was in the headlines, it was in all the captain is to blame. And frankly, the guy was pretty irresponsible, but he wasn't the basic cause of that accident. And to stop the whole thing in terms of it was the captain's fault completely obliterates any hope of learning and improving the system. And unfortunately, this is still far too common. And there's what I call overt blame and implied blame. That's overt blame. That guy was overtly blamed, and that does happen. It's less common, in enlightened organizations. Very few organizations that I go into now just say, oh, you are to blame, we're going to discipline you. It's fairly rare. But there's what I call implied blame. And I'll just go back to this slide here and just show you briefly. That's implied blame. It's basically the bit at the bottom, provide some refresher training. Because what it's saying is, well, they made a mistake and they haven't followed their training. So you should have been paying more attention and give them some more training because they clearly haven't. It's hit them over the head a bit more with a big hammer and maybe that'll fix the problem. That's implied blame. And that is really common. And so you've got to ask yourself, really, are you getting beyond the blame culture? Do you really understand that human error, yes, will be there, but that's the starting point of your investigation, your review, not the end point. You've got to get below those errors into the contextual factors that made it the case that for that person on that day, it made complete sense what they were doing. And if you were put in that situation, you probably do exactly the same thing. So that's implied blame. So Sidney Dekker, I'm sure you've heard of him, and others have written many great books on this. This is one very good book, Just Culture. It is a balancing act, and there are all issues around accountability. If you want to, I can't go into that into a lot of detail today. I'm sure you know some of this already, but that's a good place to start if you don't. One of the things that Dekker is saying is it's not who is to blame, it's where you draw the line. That's the key thing. And it's about whether your people trust the people who are drawing the line, because the line, frankly, can be drawn anywhere anybody chooses. It's a very grey, murky area. And so it ultimately boils down to trust in senior leadership, trust that what they are really motivated to do is to learn. And if the trust is there and they trust them to draw the line in a good place, you will get much better, higher levels of reporting. So another key takeaway from today is it's about, if you want successful learning, successful reporting, you've got to find ways of building trust. And again, there's a ton of science around this, how you do it. Not all trust is good, by the way, paradoxically, and I'll leave it there. I can talk further about that on another day. Moving on then. Number 4, you must adopt a systems approach. Have a quick look at this short video. Sorry, it jumped slightly there, but you get the idea. So there is world-class performance. A pit stop lane, that's a world record, 1.87 seconds. That has been achieved through what is called a process called marginal gains. You may have heard of this. A marginal gain is a process where you're looking for micro improvements that may only give you like 1% improvement, something like that. But if you get 10 of them, you get a 10% improvement. And so it's about baby steps. But to get a marginal gain system in place, you have to systematize learning. It's basically another word for saying we are never going to stop. We are never going to give up on learning. And in fact, it's about learning from successful performance as much as unsuccessful. And again, this is another key takeaway that we're going to look at briefly in a minute. So marginal gain, I mean, all of the leading organizations out there in the world are using this systemization of learning. It doesn't matter whether it, how do you think Amazon has taken over the world? One of their key secrets is the marginal gain process. They're constantly looking to learn. And we've seen how Alcoa used the same process, but it's about engaging with the workforce and recruiting their active involvement in that process. Marginal gains, breaking down the task, understanding how to do it, and then implementing these improvements. And no improvement is too small. Moving on then, number 5, understand the context and the situation. In my experience, this is one of the key failures of many accident incident reporting systems that I've already alluded to in the little mocked up accident incident report there. There's a fundamental failure to understand what actually was going on. So they talk about what happened, somebody went up a ladder, or they put a ladder against the wall, and they shouldn't really have done that because it wasn't appropriate, for that situation. It was slightly at the wrong angle, and they didn't get somebody to foot the ladder, and as a result, they fell off and broke a bone, and there's all of that stuff. And then at the end, it's like root cause. Well, we need to train them a bit more, and we maybe look at ways of stabilizing ladders. And there's no context there. There's no understanding of what were the circumstances surrounding that. Were they in a rush? What was the group thing? What were other people saying to them at the time? What were the other pressures? What time of day did this happen? What was it, the end of a working day, etc. There's a ton of things like that, contextual things that need to be understood that rarely get asked or considered. So what I want to do now is introduce to you what I call brain hazards. These are ways in which, as a human being, we operate. This is a bit like an owner's manual of how the human being works. And we need to understand how it works, because you can set people up for success or you can set people up for failure. And if you don't understand how the human machine works, then it's easy to miss the contextual circumstances that are setting people up to fail. It's also easy to miss the opportunities to help them achieve even greater success. So these are them. I'll go through them briefly, very briefly, but we could, talk in detail about any one of these. But memory, people remembering things, many accidents have occurred because people, do you know what? I did have some training, but when it happened, I completely forgot. Multitasking, we know that if you're giving people too much, there's no such thing as multitasking. It doesn't exist. It just means spreading yourself across lots of different things and you do them less well. And there's a big cost as people switch from one thing to other. Particularly, we've got two fundamental systems in our head, the auditory and visual. And if one task is highly visual and we switch to another task that's highly visual, there's a big cost. But if we switch from a visual task to an auditory task, there's less of a cost. So there's subtleties here that need to be understood. Fatigue, I've already talked about. Groupthink, in the aviation sector in the 70s and 80s, NASA said the problem is not the plane. We were getting a lot of accidents from planes being crashed that were technically sound. And what they found was because of the hierarchical structure of the captain was sitting there saying, you shut up and you do as I'm told. So there were accidents where the captain was making a mistake. The co-pilot had clearly spotted it, but dared not say anything, and they literally died as a result of that. So groupthink, the way teams are structured, big issue. Visual perception, we'll look at a few examples in a minute. Decision-making, big issue. The way we make decisions, you can help people, you can hinder people. Pressure and stress, a lot of errors are due to this. And then finally, one area I've worked in heavily is automatic behaviors. Skilled behaviors are by their very definition those that we can hand over into the autopilot, which means that we can do them without any conscious awareness of what's going on. And we can actually drift off in our mind to do other things. So you can be driving your car and thinking, oh, did I pay that bill? And what am I going to have for tea tonight? And by the time you get to your destination, you can't remember anything about how many traffic lights you went through or all the critical safety information, all completely not consciously retained. So automatic behaviors, big issue. And this is why, paradoxically, more experienced people are just as vulnerable to accidents as new recruits. Never gets a look in many accident investigations. So let's have a look at a few examples to illustrate this. What I want you to do is watch this short video, and I want you to count the number of times the ball is passed between the white team. Remember, that's your task. How many passes have been made? Here we go.
City streets are crowded and chaotic, so seeing everything that's going on can be difficult. Here's a test. How many times does the white team pass the ball? If you answered 11, you're correct. But did you notice anything else? Always be aware of what's around you, and remember that it's easy to miss something if you're not looking for it.
So if you haven't seen that video before, you probably almost definitely didn't see the wolf going across there in wolf clothing. There's many different examples of that. If you have seen it, then okay, you knew what to look for. But what this demonstrates is what psychologists call inattention blindness. When you're focused very much on a visual task, your brain will cut out all extraneous other information. And this is a big issue in many incidents and accidents, that people were focused on the task and they just didn't see the obvious thing. Why on earth didn't they see that? Why didn't they take evasive actions? maybe it was because of inattention blindness. So a big issue in complex environments where lots of things are happening and people are focused on skilled tasks. Here's another one. So I'm going to show you two pictures, right? And in between these two pictures is a blank screen. Between these two, they're virtually the same, but there is a difference between the two pictures. See whether you can spot the difference. Here's the first picture, blank screen, second picture. I'll do it a few times to see whether you can spot it. So there's the original. There's the second. Can you spot the difference? If you can, you would be a superhuman being. Well done if you can. Well, let me now show you the same thing, but I'm going to take out the blank screen I'm going to go between the two immediately. Ready? Here we go. Oh, sorry. Do you see the difference now? So there's a tree on the bank and there's a little white line coming in and out. So this is what, again, is termed change blindness. Now, when you're actually looking at the thing and a change happens, the human brain and the eye is actually very attuned to looking at movement and changes like that. You pick it up immediately, small detail like that. But when you don't get to see it actually happen and you look away and come back, you find it almost impossible to see these small changes. This is a big issue in accidents. Things like driving, you're going along, you look out the rear, look out the side mirror, look away, look back again, maybe a quarter of a second, that's all it takes. And a major change kind of occurred, but just like that, you didn't see it. And this is why, for example, there's a lot of accidents at junctions because people glanced out, looked back and looked back again, and they didn't see something that had just come in basically right in front of them. They didn't see it. Change blindness. Couple more examples. Most people won't see the mistake in this sentence. Do you see it? I didn't see it when I first saw it. There's the mistake. The reason you didn't see the mistake is because reading is an automated behavior. You're doing it automatically. Your brain is taking over. You're not having to put manual effort into this, and you skipped over the two there's because that's just a good shortcut. So this is an example of automated behavior, how it can trick us. Here's another one. What do you think this says? Can you read this? Are you reading this? What are you reading? You're not reading this because it's garbled nonsense, but your brain is reading it. And this is a key message. You don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. You don't read with your eyes, you read with your brain. And there are many, many automated processes going on inside our head. In fact, 90% of what's going on inside of our brains, we are consciously unaware of it. And it's amazing what the brain can do. It has lots of these lightning fast processes and shortcuts, but it can trip us up. It can lead us into places we didn't intend to go. It can cause and trigger accidents, which in hindsight, seem obvious. Why on earth did they do that? Oh, I can't understand it. This is part of the understanding that needs to be brought to bear if we are to learn. This is a short video from one of the crew on the Costa Concordia. Just listen to this.
Concordia was set to deviate from their original route, but it was a deviation that had been sailed many times before.
1 week before, we actually sailed right past that same point, and I was sitting on the deck, and we got so close to the land. I actually stood up and picked up the emergency phone, and I was going to call the bridge and say, hey, are we a bit close? I kind of shut that down. I looked up at the bridge and I saw that everybody, all the staff were paying attention. And so I kind of subdued my concern and put the phone back down.
So there's an example of groupthink. Somebody there had actually spotted the problem, but because of the social norm, the way that within that organization, the teams were thinking as a group, she suppressed that information and didn't act upon it. So this is a big issue. You know, again, you have to think, what was that person doing with that ladder, but what was the group thing? What was actually going on contextually with all the people around them? Did that person just look to their left and see other people doing similar things that made it okay, and so on? Tenerife air crash, the world's worst air crash to this day, happened in 1977. 2 jumbo jets collided on the runway. The facts of this accident are that the KLM pilot took off without proper clearance. And as they were rolling down the runway, the voice recording clearly indicates the co-pilot feebly, quite feebly, did we actually receive permission? The co-pilot had figured it out, but didn't forcefully say, stop, we have not got permission to take off. So that's an example of where groupthink, and in that period, there was this very hierarchical command structure, as I mentioned, that made it very difficult for co-pilots to say, I have the authority here to step in and stop. It would probably be a demotion for that person if they had done that. We know that they were at the end of their flight hours. If they hadn't have taken off in the next few minutes, they'd have had to turn around and change crew. They were fatigued. There's another one here, which the American Airline Pilots Association called the training syndrome. And this is basically where there is a difference between the real world and the training scenario. So this KLM pilot was the most experienced pilot for that airline and had something like 10,000 hours in the simulator. Now, in the simulator, there was a crucial small difference in the way they were trained. In the simulator, you received your route information, and when you got that, you could take off. You didn't need any further permission. In the real world, you receive your route information, you wait, then you receive a second clear indication you can now take off. And what we think happens, or what the investigators think happened, is under the stress, pressure to take off, he reverted to this automated behavior, a completely skilled behavior. He did what he'd been trained to do. He took off without proper clearance. So he'd been trained to do that as an automatic skill. So these are just examples of how these different factors come in. The visual, there was fog, they couldn't see, and so on. Final example I'll give you is the Texas City oil refinery in 2005, blew up, killed, I believe 15 workers, hundreds were badly injured. It was a restart of a refinery process, which is very complex. Bottom line was that these people made bad decisions and they got that process wrong. We know from the investigation that they were fatigued. They'd been working long shifts over many days. We know that their training had been pared right back and that they hadn't been given the simulation training that they needed to actually understand the decision-making process that they needed. The design of the equipment made it very difficult for them to visually see what was going on, and so on. So you get the idea. Almost there now. Identify work as imagined as opposed to work as done. This is another biggie. Far too often in the health and safety profession, in my opinion, in my experience, we sit up here and we have this imagined work in things called risk assessments and standard operating procedures. The reality on the ground is often very different. And we have to get down to that reality on the ground. And the only way you can do that is to harness the participation of the people on the ground. They have to be, they're the experts. They actually know. And it's what Sidney Dekker calls, they complete the design. So we have this theoretical design in terms of a work process system, but it's always incomplete. And they go out into the real world and they make that difference between the theory and the reality on the ground. And that difference is what we need to understand if we are to learn. So this is one example. It's going on a client site and we're talking about this kind of tail lift operation. And we're talking to an experienced guy and I said, just show me what you do. And he goes, well, we have this tail lift and I'm supposed to put these sides up as we take the load up and down. I say, I always like that word supposed. What do you mean you're supposed to? He goes, well, I can't always do it. I said, why not? He said, because we have these pallets that are too big. Some of them are too big and they stick out over the side and you can't get all the sides up. And the safety person was standing next to me and that person was gobsmacked. He's like, what? They didn't know, they never heard that before. This is the kind of stuff you need to know about. It's not caused an accident in that incident, in that organization at that point, but it certainly could do. And it's that kind of thing that you need to get to if you want to really learn. And this is what, in his book, The Safety Anarchist, Sidney Dekker refers to this type of process as vernacular safety. It's what people will do on the ground to complete the design. They will make it up. And they, most of the time, let's be honest about it, 99.9% of the time, they're successful at doing this stuff. They're really good at it. They'll find the workarounds, they'll find the fixes, they'll put up with these little chafings in the system, and they'll do it, and they'll do it really well, vast majority of the time. And so what you're going to see is the only difference between that and an accident is just probability, just chance. It's all there waiting for you to be discovered, to learn from and improve if you can get in there the processes you need. Accept that learning means change, and it means change around these things. And you have to get into actually saying, what is the performance difference we want? What do we want people to do as a result of this accident, incident, review, investigation, whatever you want to call it? But all too often, again, the recommendations that I see are, well, maybe just redesign a little thing on the side there and give them a bit more refresher training, and that should do it. Embed learning in a continuous improvement process. We kind of already touched upon this in the marginal gain, but this is Amy Edmondson is a psychologist, and she's done a lot of work in this space. This is a great book if you're interested in this space. One of the studies she did is she looked at nursing teams, and she called them type A, type B. And type A's, she looked at errors reported and errors made on the job. And type A's reported lots of errors, and type B's reported virtually no errors. But when they then went back over time and looked at the actual number of errors made, type A's were making this number and type B's were making this number. So the point that she's making through this elegant study is the more errors you report, the more you learn, the better your performance. It's self-evident, isn't it? But this is not what happens. The key takeaway here, though, is that she found fundamental differences in the soft social skills in the immediate line manager supervisors. The way in which type A, type B managers managed their team was fundamentally different. And so if you want excellent reporting, excellent investigations and learnings, a big part of the story is the soft, nothing to do with safety per se. It's how these people manage their teams, the way they communicate with their teams. In rough terms, type Bs were seen as authoritarian, things like heads will roll if things go wrong, all of this sort of stuff. Whereas type As were not a pushover, but they were more hands-on with their team. They're helping them to figure out what works, what didn't work. They wouldn't hesitate to, step in and say, listen, that's unacceptable. But they were much more forgiving of people coming to them and saying, look, this is a problem, this is an error that I made. They in fact welcomed it. So these are soft communication skills that are fundamental to type A, type B teams. Final one, don't confuse recommendations with solutions. I mean, I could go on and on about this, but this is just so common. This guy here, let me just give you an example. This guy, Captain James Lancaster, he's the chap who discovered the cure for scurvy in 1601. He actually ran a randomized controlled trial, had 4 sail ships going to India, and on one of them he gave all the sailors lemon juice, on the others he didn't. Everybody on the lemon juice ship arrived safely. Many of the sailors on the other 3 ships died from scurvy. He proved beyond doubt that lemon juice can help improve scurvy. How long do you think it took the British Navy to instigate giving lemon juice to sailors as a matter of routine? 5 years? 10 years? 20 years? 50 years? More than 50? Let's have a look. In fact, it took 194 years. Can you believe it? Well, it's a matter of historical fact. 194 years. Let's look at some modern day equivalents. How long do you think it takes the healthcare sector, when they discover this fabulous new way of treating a patient, for that to become a matter of routine practice globally? How long do you think it takes them? Well, let's hope it's less than 194 years, yeah? 17 years. I pushed one too many buttons there. You gave my line away. The aviation sector, in many instances, is down to weeks, a month or 2. So globally, when a major incident happens, within weeks, it goes out to every pilot in the world on that class of plane. This, you need to pay attention to. You need to do this differently. And we are coming through with other changes, but this is what you need to do. Now let's look at how they actually, so this is what's called the learning adoption rate, or the LAR. And my question to you is to think about is, where do you sit on this spectrum? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 17 years? Remember, Paul O'Neill at the very beginning of this session was talking about 24 hours. Do you remember that? And this was a guy in 1987 was talking about a worldwide system. Think back, for those of you, I'm certainly old enough, for those of you old enough, what were you doing in 1987? I didn't have a mobile phone, I don't think then. We were certainly using fax machines. And he's talking about a worldwide system that you can log on and learn from within 24 hours. Look, if Paul O'Neill can do it then, we can do it now. And we can do a lot better job at what we're doing now. So where do you sit? Are you 2 weeks to 24 hours, or are you up in years, or maybe even longer, as in never? One of the reasons why healthcare is so slow is this is how they communicate out to practitioners. You literally spend your life getting through this stuff to actually, and they do, they have to read and they have to plow through, and it's complex stuff, and you have to sort the chaff from the wheat. This is how the aviation sector communicate to pilots. This is one example of following a major incident with an Airbus over the Pacific Ocean that went down. This is how the pilots were shown what happened. Sorry, here we go.
Reconfiguration to alternate long, normal low-high angle of attack protection was lost. The crew identified the speed indication anomaly.
As we're running out of time, I won't play the end of that, but you get the idea that that was like a 4-minute video which reconstructed the cockpit, showed the pilots exactly what happened, and there was a little bit of learning in it, and that went out globally. And there's other things as well, but it's very user-friendly, it's very practical, and that's how one of the ways in which they learn from incidents. Finally then, as we're coming to the end of the time available, putting this into action, just a few thoughts for you to maybe give you some hints. We've already talked about this, but research shows, and it doesn't matter what sector you can go in, they've looked at construction, they've looked at researchers, aviation, healthcare. When they look at the tasks that are performed in healthcare, for example, they find that roughly 1 in 13 cycles of a task are unsuccessful. The other 12 are successful. But when they look at the 12 that went right, when they dig down into the context, what they see is the same errors are occurring, exactly the same errors, their workarounds, the little things that people are managing to cope with. They're all there in the successful performances. You may be horrified to learn that in 88% of airline flights, there are significant human errors. So it's a routine thing. These are significant in the sense that they are potentially life-threatening. But the way the crews manage that situation and the training that they've been given mean that the vast majority of time, it doesn't matter, they're able to deal with it. So the point is, one of the things that if you want to be successful, is start looking at your successful performance as well as your unsuccessful. Because one of the things I see is it's called being at the thin end of the wedge. You're probably working in a very safe environment, a very safe organization. You probably have a diminishing number of accidents and incidents. You've got very small amounts of data. What we know from the science, like Texas City, they had received just prior to that accident an award for ultra low accidents and incidents. And this is a recurring theme. Ultra safe organizations have very low incident rates, but often go on and have major incidents. So start looking at your successful performance. Start looking at what's going on there. Texas City, what evidence have we got that these people can actually start up a refinery successfully? How can we show that, and can we prove that? That would have shown a lot of information that would have been useful for learning. But that stuff is routinely not included, routinely not reported. So think of it like this: accidents, incidents, near misses, successful performance is much, much bigger, and it's much richer in terms of your learning. You need to push your learning system into successful performance as well. So there we are. There are the 9 principles. If you actually bust these out, you can put them into 3 basic categories of what you might call a learning system. You've got to get reports coming in. You've got to get detection going on. You've got to analyze this stuff to learn the right lessons. Remember, you know, the plane, the bullet holes and all the other stuff. You've got to learn the right lessons here. And then you've got to then feed this back. And it's not about just making recommendations. You've got to put in ways that are going to help your people to actually implement this stuff. And the 9 principles actually fall into these 3 buckets. And what you could actually start to think of this is an organizational learning system. And you could actually start to do yourself a little gap analysis. Go out there and ask some questions. How do we measure up to these principles, these standards? Just do a quick qualitative analysis, see where your challenges are. I'm willing to bet that some of you out there are doing a great job in many of these areas. Brilliant, celebrate that success. But I'm also willing to bet that there's some areas where you could definitely improve. And this is just a very quick, simple, just draw yourself a star diagram like this and see where you sit on this spectrum and see what shape that you get out at the end of it. You then also got to think about your competencies. Ultimately, this is about helping your people do it for themselves. And that's from senior management right down to front line. And again, when I go out there, I see lack of competency from all concerned, a lack of understanding, things like management, mindset and style. How your managers react to failure is 101 for learning. The way they react is fundamental, and they can kill it in a second by the way they react, or they can foster that learning in brilliant ways just by simple reaction to when somebody comes to them. So this is about soft skills. What is the role and functioning of your system, and how does it work? Everybody involved, from those reporting to analysing, need to understand the human factors, because again, I don't see the level of understanding routinely in these investigations, and as a result, we often see it's the implied blame, it's the how on earth did they do that reaction, because of this lack of understanding. You need, just to begin with, how does these learning systems work? You know, what is our, and this cannot really be an off-the-shelf thing. Your organization is going to be unique. You're going to have to mold this to your organization, to your culture, and then you're going to have to tell your people what this thing is for and what it's trying to achieve. And that bottom one is again, I haven't had time to go into all this, but some of the science, the reason why a lot of these systems fail is just because of a lack of feedback, a lack of feeding back to people. There need to be feedback loops all over the place. And there are lots of simple ways that you can do that. So there it is. I think I've run over slightly. Thank you for bearing with me. So let me just do very, very quickly before we go to questions. I'm going to do a couple of things. There is there's the link to the CIHF white paper. You can get that there. If you would like to come to, I do lots of these professional development events. If you'd like to follow me and see what future events, I go into a lot of these things in more detail. There I am on LinkedIn. By all means, follow me and you'll get alerts. And then finally, I have written a book on all of this stuff. This is it, Achieving Health and Safety Training Success. In there, I go into the science. I look at the case studies like Texas City, the KLM. I demonstrate how all of this can affect learning and so on. So that's a great resource if that's of an area of interest to you. So there it is. Finally, there is my email address. Feel free to email me with any thoughts if you want more information. So thank you for listening. I hope that has been helpful to you. I'm happy to enter into any discussions, answer any questions. Thank you very much for your kind comments that are coming up.
Thanks, Ian. That was an incredibly thought-provoking insight. So thank you very much for the session today. There's a few sort of takeaways for me generally. I mean, I've got some key comments here. We've got building trust, marginal gains, looking at the context and brain hazards, vernacular safety, learning adoption rates, feedback loops. Fantastic, areas that we can, as safety professionals, perhaps go into further research on, and also looking at turning those failures into opportunities and making sure accident reporting is not just compliance driven, but actually, we look at that as an opportunity as well. And I think, one of the real key takeaways for me is the language we use. What do you call your reporting system? Is it a reporting system? Is it a learning system?
Absolutely. I mean, a reporting system just sounds scary, doesn't it?
Exactly. And I think, something as simple as that actually puts a positive spin on what we're trying to achieve here. And I think, making sure we actually delve deeper into that root cause analysis and not have that hindsight bias, I think is something which certainly has given me, and I'm sure everybody else who's listened to the session today, a lot of food for thoughts. And also thank you very much for sharing with us the references and resources that you've used, because there's some really interesting publications out there which I'm sure the Amazon world will certainly benefit from. And all I can say is I wish I'd have got some shares in Alcoa as well, because I could have made a fortune. So that is absolutely fantastic. Thank you today. And we've had some really interesting chats and comments on the way, but I'm just going to hand over to Kane just to see if there's any questions that our audience want to put specifically to you. So Kane, is there anything
there was some of the questions got answered along the way in Ian's presentation. Yeah, great presentation, Ian, and some brilliant questions have come through. Okay. Justin asked the question with regards to, is there any evidence that shows that changing the terminology from accident to incident has an effect on the workplace culture?
Yes, there is. There's been a lot of research done, which I can share. Either if you want to come direct, I can give you some links. But there's been a lot of research done into accident, incident and near-miss reporting systems. And some of it is actually counterintuitive. It's not obvious, but definitely, some of the key takeaways is we know, that the way in which management react is fundamental to that success. We know that feedback is fundamental. We also know that the way in which people think, what people think the system is for, is fundamental. So I'll give you one example. Let's say I'm a professional electrician. I've got a very much high level of pride in what I do. and I come across a problem and I fix it, and people like fixing problems. It reinforces their professional identity. I fixed it. Why do I need to report that? I fixed it. Also, what do you mean I report it and you're going to come and fix it for me? Well, why? I'm a professional. So the way in which people think about what this thing is for and their relationship with it is fundamental. So we go out there and go, report problems, come to a, and you've got all of these different mindsets. So it's about positioning it and marketing it and getting that message across in the right way. And every organization is going to be different. That messaging is going to be subtly different, but absolutely. I mean, it's in hindsight, it's one of those things. It's really clear, and the research has backed that up.
Alan asked a question from within his organisation, and although we have a good standard of promotion of health and safety for near misses, etc., yeah, reporting within his business, we've made it very easy for reporting of incidents. Workers still believe that they'll be disciplined for reporting. How do we break that stigma? So
this is so common, and this ultimately comes back to competency and training from the very top down through line management. It's about the culture of the organisation, and that is why I always include the Paul O'Neill story, because what it makes clear to everybody is this is about cultural change. It's about embedding within your organisation processes, but that ultimately is about the way the organisation gets managed from the top down. And so, you know, there's been a lot of research done, and there's very active leading people out there. People like Sidney Decker is one that have published a lot of stuff around this and what's involved. But fundamentally, it is about starting with your senior management. They need to understand what this thing is for. It's not a compliance box ticking thing, right? If that's all they think it is, you've lost. You've got to get them into the place where, look, this is about achieving world-class performance. It's about driving this organization to higher levels, to becoming the Amazon of our sector, or whatever, whichever way you want. That speaks their language. That's going to, what you mean we can drive commercial success with? Absolutely. Why? Because health and safety is a keystone habit, and it will affect all of these other habits. And here's the evidence, and there's loads of it. So you've got to get that message across to your senior management, and then it's got to get successfully down. And that's why Paul O'Neill went out and gave out his phone number, because he knew that there were going to be some line managers who wouldn't necessarily buy into that. And there's one example of Paul O'Neill actually firing a senior management because they didn't actually get on board with what he was talking about. He dismissed them, and it went out. And it was at that point that the workforce realized he was really, really serious about this. So if people are still fearful of getting blamed, it's about the culture, and you've got to go back up there. And there's a ton of literature around how you might do that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you for your answer on that. Jim has a question with regards to health and safety is everyone's responsibility. What are your thoughts on companies offering incentives to report incidents and near misses?
No, don't do it. Don't go near that. There's just some horror stories around that whole thing. I mean, I'm going to be slightly controversial here, because I saw that the January issue of the IOSH magazine was all about zero accidents. And then this is the flip side of reporting. There's just really good reasons why zero accidents should not be your goal. There's a ton of science around it. It's going to harm what you're trying to do. That's not to say that zero accidents isn't a good thing. And well, all right, Ian, what target should we have then? Well, of course we all want zero accidents, but I mean, just very briefly, what you're doing there is you're focusing on the dependent variable. And what that means is that you're not focusing on the independent variables, which are the things you want to actually manipulate. So if you get around incentives, zero accidents, it all goes horribly wrong. You're much better to talk about learning. It's much better to foster participation in learning. Much better to talk about incentives for successful performance, because that's a never-ending story. It never ends, and that just reinforces everybody's best interests, including senior management.
That's brilliant. I wish I had time to go through all the questions, but we've got one more to go through, which it's a joint question between Mark, Tariff and Sarah.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how to encourage different cultures and nationalities to report? These individuals have sites globally, and their UK reporting system is very well, and they're finding that they're not getting the reporting come through in other cultures and countries. You got any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do, and it's a fairly long answer. Don't have time today. If you want to drop me an email, I'm just going to put my email in the box here so everybody's got it, because I don't think I was sharing. Oh, that's not it. Don't use that one. It's ian@humanfocus.co.uk. By all means, drop me an email. Happy to have an offline conversation. In the short answer for now is that as you go around the world, obviously there are different cultures. There are different norms of behavior in terms of what is acceptable, what isn't. I mean, that's just self-evident. What isn't, what is a consistent factor is that everybody wants to go home at the end of the day safe. Most organizations around the world want to be successful. They want to achieve commercial success. They're the constants, but you definitely will have cultural differences. And this is what I was coming back to when I said just earlier, there's not an off-the-shelf single system here that's going to work everywhere at once. It's got to take account of the local cultural circumstances, and I can talk more about that in more detail, either offline or maybe in another session.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'll be sure to share your details on our platforms afterwards. So thank you. That's all the questions we've got time for today, unfortunately, guys. But I'll hand you back over to Rachel.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks very much for hosting the questions. And Ian, thank you once again, not only for your presentation, but providing some additional insight with your answers to those questions. So yeah, fantastic session. Thank you very much indeed for today. And without further ado, I will just hand back over to Angela now, just to end today's session from the East Anglia branch.
That's great. Wow, what a session. Thanks to Rachel for organising that today. And Ian, thanks ever so much for giving your time. Fantastic, really good. Do you know, we had over 100 people, 109 or 110, I think, there at one stage. And I think we've still got over 90 odd on the call. So it just shows, you know, how engaging it was. A global audience too, some really interesting roles and some really interesting destinations that people were joining us from. We did have one or two yellow hands up. I know, Ahmed, I'm sorry, right at the end there, you tried to raise your hand. We couldn't take direct questions just through time factors and the fact, you know, we've got several hundred sounds good, doesn't it? 100 people there. So, you know, to actually take direct questions, it would have been difficult. But Ian has shared his contact details, so I'm sure he won't mind if somebody wants to get in touch. I think looking outside the obvious, thinking deeper, looking beyond the operative and blaming that operative in training, which we so easily do, don't we? Even as consultants, we go in and say, oh yeah, that was a bit of a human error, we better train him again, and that sort of thing. So looking beyond that, looking at management, procurement, budgets, cultural stuff, responsibility, and just behaviours in general. That brain hazard slide really struck a chord with me. You know, there's so much to it, what goes on in our heads, how we're diverted and that kind of thing. So, and I think somebody, there were two comments in the chat. One said, look in the mirror first, and as management, I think that's perhaps something we should do. And somebody said there, instead of call it a near miss, call it a near hit. That might focus a few people's brains, which is a good thing. And learning means change, you know, and hopefully that change, as you say, it doesn't take too long to come about. Again, as consultants, we go in sometimes and say, right, I think we need to do this immediately. And then you touch base with your client several weeks later, and immediate just hasn't been immediate. There's always a reason why they haven't managed to do it, even if it's dangerous. So, yeah, not too long about those changes. Somebody asked about recording. Yes, this will be is recorded, will be edited, and it will be posted soon on our East Anglia IOSH branch microsite on the IOSH website, and then on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. So finally then, thanks to my delivery team, you know, these things don't just happen magically. There's a good deal of stuff that goes on in the background with organising speakers and getting this all online. So thanks for that. I've got such a great supporting team, so thank you to them all. Remember to look out for the AGM notification and notice of our next event. Natasha's organising this. It's a bit of a how are you kind of support session really, just to look after our members a bit, and that's going to be on the 12th of March. So if you want to drop in, have a general chat, air some views, or talk about anything current with you, I'm sure Natasha's going to host that, and we'll get some questions and answers going there, and just generally get together, a bit of a networking thing. If you need to get in touch with the committee for anything, you know, comments, congratulations, help with CPD, IPD, mentoring, or want a certificate for attendance, then email eastanglia@ioshnetworks.com. That's eastanglia@ioshnetworks.com. And then all it remains for me to say now is really take care of yourselves. Don't let that COVID guard come down too soon. I know it's feeling safer and that the news is good, but just don't let that guard come down too soon. So keep safe, and we'll see you next time. So thanks for joining us, and we'll now close the meeting. So cheers for now. Bye bye.